Welcome everyone. You are listening to the account with a new summary for day 377 of the war in Ukraine. Thank you for tuning in again today. Today I have again 3 articles I want to point out. Additionally, I have a small update regarding the Ukrainian POW execution. All other updates are grouped into the usual: situation inside Ukraine, the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, including Lukashenko's press conference about the A-50 plane and his accusations of Ukraine, and international developments. But before we start the news, the flashpoints along the front. Bakhmut. The Russian advance north of Bakhmut continues to stall. No significant progress has been reported in a few days. Attack intensity continues to be quite high, with 37 repelled attacks near Dubovo-Vasilivka alone. It seems Ukrainian reinforcements have managed to stall Russian plans for now. South of Bakhmut, the situation remains stable. One interesting note today was the General Staff reported repelled attacks in the direction of Klishchivka, which has not been reported in a long time. David Parsley of iNews and the leading journalist of the military department of The Guardian, Dan Sabak, have both reported that Western officials estimate that Russia and the Wagner PMC has suffered between 20 to 30,000 casualties trying to capture Bakhmut. The kill ratio is reportedly worse than 1 to 3, corroborating claims made by Ukrainian officials over the past days that the ratio is 1 to 5 or even worse with 1 to 7. Usually I try to stay impartial and give an objective and unemotional report. Many of my listeners have expressed their gratitude for that as well. Today, though, in a rare exception, I wanted to add a very short update on the topic of the Ukrainian POW execution video that emerged yesterday. Timofey Mykolaiovich Shadura. The General Staff of Ukraine has confirmed the identity of the Ukrainian POW executed by Russian soldiers. He has been reportedly missing since February 3rd and served in the 30th Separate Mechanized Brigade of Konstantin Ostrogsky. Rest in peace, Slava Ukraini. And now the first article I wanted to point out. Today I want to share the article Investigative Stories from Ukraine, the Kyiv Independence newsletter, with you. This article, or newsletter as you will, contains the summaries of many interesting investigative stories and links to them in full. If you have the time, I highly recommend checking it out. And now the second article I wanted to point out by the Ukrainska Pravda, titled The Kraken Attacks. The history of the GUR special unit of the Ministry of Defense, which is demonized by the Russians. This is a very lengthy but highly interesting article about the Kraken special unit, from the early beginnings to its involvement in the liberation of Kharkiv Oblast. During an interview with the Kraken commander for this article, it was stated that the chief of the Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, actually participated in the special operation to liberate the village of Ruska Lozova in Kharkiv Oblast at the end of April 2022. I highly recommend checking this article out, and you can use Google Translate for it. And finally, the third article I found, titled Season of Offensives: What to Expect from the Spring Campaign in Ukraine. This rather lengthy article is taking a look at the locations, timeframes, and results of possible offensives by Ukraine and Russia over the next month. I'm not sure how to best summarize it, as there is just too much information, so please check it out yourself. To start the news segment, a look at all the minor updates out of Ukraine. The President Office head, Andriy Yermak, reported that 126 servicemen and 4 servicewomen were released from Russian captivity during a prisoner exchange. Most of the released soldiers were defending the now occupied city of Mariupol in southeastern Ukraine, according to Yermak. 71 soldiers were reportedly evacuated from the Azovstal steel plant. Russia's TASS also reported on the exchange. The Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine has agreed on mandatory evacuation of families with children from active combat zones. According to a survey conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, almost half of Ukrainians are in favor of the immediate prosecution of people involved in corruption in the defense ministry, while the same number believe that it is necessary to conduct a longer and more thorough investigation. Interior Minister Ihor Klymenko said in an interview that the Ministry of Internal Affairs will not make public the lists of private soldiers of the offensive guard. 23,000 applications from volunteer candidates have been received and are being processed. The interview is rather long and contains many topics. I recommend checking it out. Dmytro Kotsiubailo, also known as Vinci, has died in battle near Bakhmut. He was the commander of the 1st Mechanized Battalion, the Vinci Wolves, and one of the youngest heroes of Ukraine. Vinci was at the front since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian War. In 2014, he was seriously wounded by a tank shell in Pisky, Donetsk Oblast. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. Roman Vlasenko, head of the Severodonetsk District Military Administration, has stated that local collaborators and the Russian military use Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Rubizhne in Luhansk Oblast as rear bases. There are places where troops are stationed as well as ammunition depots. Several training centers were also set up on the outskirts of Severodonetsk. Russian bases are almost everywhere in the district. Ivan Fedorov, the mayor of Melitopol, reported about an explosion occurring in the occupied town of Berdyansk. According to locals, it is the result of a hit. No further information is currently available. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, said that his country has detained more than 20 people who are allegedly involved in the explosion of the A-50 aircraft at the Matsulishchi air base. He also claimed that Belarus had detained an alleged terrorist of the Ukrainian secret services and his accomplices. Belarus previously denied reports that an A-50 was damaged. Lukashenko said, "He was born in Kryvyi Rih and lived in Crimea. Some relatives are in Austria. Some stayed in Kyiv. He was recruited by the Ukrainian Secret Service in 2014, I think. He is an IT specialist or well-versed in IT technologies. He was preparing to commit terrorist acts." Lukashenko believes that Ukraine has challenged Belarus with the sabotage of the A-50 plane at Matsulishchi airfield, and he called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a louse for this. Meanwhile, Ole Nikolenko, spokesman of the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, dismissed the accusations of Ukraine's participation in the incident on the Matsulishchi airfield. He stated, "We categorically reject Alexander Lukashenko's insinuations in regards to Ukraine's alleged participation in the events on the Matsulishchi airfield. Lukashenko has also allowed himself a gross personal rebuke of the President of Ukraine. We would not leave this act of impotence unanswered." Russia has increased the number of missile carriers in the Black Sea. There are now 4 missile carriers with a total salvo of 24 cruise missiles on combat duty. Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu claimed that the capture of Bakhmut by the Russian Federation will allow advancing deep behind the defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine. Meanwhile, an advisor to the acting head of the DPR, Denis Pushilin, claimed that Russian forces control almost half of Bakhmut. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. The Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang drew comparisons between the hypothetical Chinese military aid for Russia to US weapon sales to Taiwan. The Polish defense minister has confirmed that 10 of the promised 14 German-made Leopard 2 tanks will arrive in Ukraine in the coming days. Manfred Weber, president of the European People's Party, EPP, has said that in order to maintain security in Europe, Ukraine will need to join NATO. However, first it needs to survive the current Russian invasion. And now for the intelligence report segment, starting as usual with the UK Ministry of Defense. The Ukrainian defense of Bakhmut continues to degrade forces on both sides. Over the weekend, Ukrainian forces likely stabilized the defensive perimeter following previous Russian advances into the north of the town. A Russian strike destroyed a bridge over the only paved supply road into Bakhmut, still under Ukrainian control, around March 2nd. Muddy conditions are likely hampering Ukrainian resupply efforts as they increasingly resort to using unpaved tracks. Public disagreements between the Wagner Group and Russian Ministry of Defense over the allocation of munitions highlights the difficulty in sustaining the high levels of personnel and ammunition required to advance with their current tactics. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. The assessment is once again focused on Bakhmut. The battle for Bakhmut could seriously undermine the best forces of the Wagner PMC, depriving the Russian Federation of some of its most effective strike units, which are difficult to replace. The researchers previously reported that Russia threw the PMC's best forces into the Bakhmut assault, reinforcing them with regular army airborne troops. Wagner's attacks already once culminated and, as a result, forced the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation to send parts of its elite airborne troops into battle. The PMC's forces may once again be depleted before the city is taken, forcing the Russian military to choose between abandoning the effort or deploying better quality troops onto the battlefield once again. The Institute believes that in the conditions of defensive urban battles, there is a good opportunity to harm elite Russian units, as Russian forces have recently changed tactics and committed higher quality special forces operators and elements of conventional forces to the fight. Furthermore, the analysts corrected their previous assessment regarding the operationally or strategically significance of Bakhmut. Taking Bakhmut is necessary but not sufficient for further Russian advances in Donetsk Oblast, and Russian forces have already taken such heavy losses fighting for the city that their attack will very likely culminate after they have secured it, if not before. The loss of Bakhmut is not, therefore, of major operational or strategic concern to Ukraine, as Secretary Austin and others have observed. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. Main efforts of the enemy continues to focus on conductive offensive operations in the Kupiansk, Liman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Shachtarsk directions. The enemy continues unsuccessful offensive actions in the area of Orikhovo-Vasiliivka, Dubovo-Vasiliivka, Bakhmut, Kamianka, Avdiivka, and Marinka of Donetsk Oblast. The enemy is trying to break through the defenses of our troops on the Kupiansk and Liman directions. He led unsuccessful offensive actions in the directions of Ryanikivka, Nevske, and Spirne. The enemy continues to advance in the direction of Bakhmut. The enemy does not stop storming the city of Bakhmut. Our defenders repelled attacks in the areas of Ivanivske, Klishchivka, and Bakhmut settlements. In the Avdiivka and Shachtarsk directions, the enemy carried out unsuccessful offensive actions in the direction of the settlements of Krasnohorivka, Novokalinove, Kamianka, Severne, Pervomaiske, Nevelske, and Marinka. The enemy is defending in the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions. In the settlement of Strelkove in the Henichesk district of the temporarily occupied territory of the Kherson Oblast, in local primary education institutions, teachers and educators of the so-called occupying authorities force students and parents to stay after classes and study the constitution and legislative acts of the Russian Federation, as well as enemy history and literature. During breaks, children are forced to learn and sing the Russian national anthem. And that concludes today's report. As usual, you can find links to all the articles I mentioned in the description in case you want to read up on the details. If you enjoyed the report and found it informative, please consider sharing it with others and giving me a like. I hope you will join me again tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.